Chapter 8, Operations. This clause forms the heart of the ISO 45001 standard and addresses the program content necessary to have a successful OH&S management system that meets the intent of the standard. In other words, it goes into details about how some key processes should be done. As always, we'll start from reading what the standard tells us about it. In Clause 8.1.1, it is stated the organization must plan, implement, control, and maintain the processes necessary to meet the requirements of the OH&S management system by, first of all, establishing criteria for processes, then implementing controls that make sure that these processes are carried as planned, and, of course, maintaining and retaining the documented information if needed. This means there is no fixed list of processes, because your company has to put in place just the ones it needs, and in the specific way it works best for it. Of course, a very short list of very basic processes has to be implemented, but consider them as very basic requirements. Also, it means that you don't have to make too many procedures or too many records. Once again, just the one that needs to make the process work properly. So, if our system is like an engine made of many different gears, we could say that Clause 8 finally tells us how some of these gears should be shaped. Why not all gears? Because as we said many times, the management system is a tailor-made suit. So, different companies need different engines. So they need different kinds of gears. Clause 8 goes into detail for the very key ones that all companies that want to be 45001 certified need to have. So, from now on, we will use this modified version of that slide, in which some of those processes are specified. The key processes discussed in this section will be hierarchy of controls, to utilize the most effective means of risk reduction within the organization, management of change, to ensure that when planned changes occur, they are managed to control risk, outsourcing and procurement management, to make sure that risk controls are adequate for all outsourced processes, emergency preparedness and response, to identify potential emergency risks and develop specific and customized plans with key stakeholders to minimize these risks, determination of legal requirements, determine which laws apply to his OH&S system and act accordingly. Subchapter 8.2, Hierarchy of Controls. We will start from Hierarchy of Controls since it's the first topic of Clause 8. Hierarchy of controls. By control, we mean everything that your company puts in place to eliminate hazards, reduce risks. Operational controls can use a variety of methods. For example, the introduction of safe systems of work, preventative maintenance regimes, inspection programs, and regular reviews on the competency of workers. But the standard is really clear on this point when choosing what to do for OH&S. It should follow an overall hierarchy. How is this hierarchy structured? Globally, the following principle is always valid. Before doing anything that aims at risk reduction, our company should do everything that is possible to eliminate the hazard in the first place. In the next slide, we'll dive into details. The so-called hierarchy of controls is made of these steps. Elimination. Eliminate the dangers. Substitution. Replace with less dangerous processes, operating activities, materials, or equipment. Engineering controls. Use technical design measures and reorganize the work. Administrative controls. Use organizational measures, including training. PPE. Use suitable PPE. Think of it as a reverse pyramid. What lies at the top is more important, and therefore has to be done or evaluated before. And what stands at the bottom is less critical, and has to be done only as a last resort. Let's do an exercise together. We could think of our example of a cheese factory as a very noisy factory, in which most of the noise comes from its machineries. What should the OH&S specialist do in an ISO 45001 company? The first thing we should try is step 1, elimination. Hazard elimination could be done by changing completely how your factory makes cheese. Since this is not very likely, we have to move forward in the hierarchy. So, we could try step 2, which is substitution. It could be done by replacing the dangerous with non-dangerous, such as changing the old machinery with new and less noisy machinery. Of course, this is not always possible, because maybe your company can't really afford new machines. Or maybe the machines it has are not that old. Or maybe silent machines, for this specific task, just don't exist. As you may think, these two steps are quite strong. They ask your company to change drastically. But your company is not forced to do the first and second step. It just has to prove that when it evaluates the risks, at least these steps are always taken into consideration. So, let's move to step 3, engineering controls. A good way to eliminate hazards could be changing the factory layout. Maybe most of the work could be done in another area in which the noise level is significantly lower. Only after we tried to eliminate the hazard, then we could go through the path of risk reduction. This could be achieved through implementing protective measures, such as insulating the machinery, or providing and ensuring the use of personal protective equipment, such as ear protection. If it's not possible, let's move to step 4, administrative control. The fourth way would be giving workers specific training to teach them how to operate in order to spend as little time as possible near the noisy machines. And finally, the fifth step, PPE. The final resort that has to be done only after the ones before is giving PPE to all your workers. The moral of the story is that a company that is 45001 certified should somehow prove that all the possible measures were taken, and of course that the correct hierarchy has been followed. You can't just give PPE to your workers without at least trying to solve the problem at the root. This is usually done through technical meetings, at the end of which a technical report is written. Periodically, ideally at least once a year, the organization should do these technical meetings in order to improve continuously the way it takes care of all of its EHS issues. Subchapter 8.3, Management of Change. As you can see from this slide, management of change is just one of the many gears of your system, but you will see how it could be considered one of the most relevant. The first question is, why does a company need to manage change? Because it's proven that bad management of change is one of the most common causes of injuries and accidents. Think it this way. Your company works with conditions A, B, C, D. Condition A may be using a certain machine. Condition B may be using a certain PPE. Condition C may be using a certain substance. So your company works with conditions A, B, C, D, and your worker is completely fine. Days pass by. Day 2. Day 3. Day 4. Day 5. All the conditions are the same and the worker keeps being fine. Then something changes. Condition D changes into condition E and your worker is injured. Think about it. It's still true that your company provided a safe working environment for these 5 days, but it's also true that your company wasn't able to do that for very long. As soon as the condition changed, the workplace became unsafe. What could be this condition D? It could be a substance used in the workplace. Condition D could be using nitrogen as propellant, while condition E could be using ethane as propellant. In our example, just a minor change caused a very serious consequence. So, those working conditions were a very fragile equilibrium. In other words, your company wasn't able to manage change. Clause 8.1.3 of the 45001 standard gives us some more details about what kind of changes your company should manage changes. The organization must establish one or more processes to control planned and unplanned changes that could impact on OH&S performance. In the following slides, we will see some examples of these changes. New products, processes, or services. This means that your company may have to change the product they make for many reasons. Maybe one kind of product is not popular enough and your company needs to come out with a new product. If it happens, someone should ask, does this new kind of product cause a change in my process? Is it riskier or less risky? Also, changes to work locations, working conditions, processes, procedures, equipment, or the company's organizational structure have to be taken into consideration. Changes to applicable legal and other requirements. Laws can change. It happens. The company needs to have someone who is capable of finding out of these changes and do whatever needed to the new requirements of the new laws. Changes in knowledge or information concerning hazards and associated risks. This happens a lot in some areas, such as production of chemicals. One raw material could be used for years and years, until some new scientific paper finds that it is more hazardous than previously thought. This in turn requires your company to change the way this raw material is handled by workers. Developments in knowledge and technology. This is almost self-explanatory. Technological changes can remove some kinds of hazards and add other kinds of hazards. This has to be taken into consideration. Last but not least, the organization must review the consequences of involuntary changes, taking action to mitigate any negative effects as far as necessary. So now, hopefully, our previous example is clearer. Your company was safe because of many conditions. Then, just one condition, as small as changing a machine or changing a substance happened, and all of a sudden, all the previous safe conditions don't apply anymore. We may all agree by now that management of change is important, and that it needs to be done through a specific process. How could this process be? This means writing on a procedure what to do in the event a change is needed. Who is the change initiator? Who can find out that there is the need to change something? How to report a change? Who should they report to, and by what means? Some companies have a dedicated form in which every employee can notify that there is the need to change something. Who evaluates the change? Usually there is a committee made by the employee that have the required technical skills to evaluate it. How to apply the change? Who makes the final check? These rules could be put into a written procedure so that there is no risk that they slightly change or get bypassed. Of course, setting the rules is just the first step. What really matters is that they are used. Let's make an example of how change management could work in a 45,001 company. Our company has several pieces of machinery. One of the company's engineers asked for one machinery to be replaced with a new one because it doesn't work correctly, thus slowing down the production. Following the change management procedures, the engineer fills out the change management form, in which he writes down the reasons why he's asking for a change. Then, this form is given to a change management committee, who evaluates what consequences could derive from the change. The EH&S specialist, who is part of the committee, evaluates if this change could have some impact on health and safety. Of course, any member of the committee evaluates the change by its specific perspective. So, the evaluation is done, and if everyone in the committee says that this change has no negative effects, the engineer receives green light, and the change is approved. This procedure could seem like too much, but most of the times, something like it is really needed, in order to avoid any change from happening without the needed evaluation regarding EH&S matters. Let's stick to our example. What could go wrong? Well, sometimes companies change their machinery just evaluating how fast it could work or how cheap it is. We have to put in place something that forces the company to always keep in consideration the possible implications in all areas of any change. In the case of a 45,001 certified company, the question is, what could change in my company's EH&S if this change is implemented? Are the new machines more noisy? Do they require less or more maintenance? Are they easier to operate? So as you can see, an effective OH&S management system helps the organization in being organized and provide a controlled workplace. Subchapter 8.4 Outsourcing and Procurement Management. Now we will focus on another very important gear of our machine, outsourcing and procurement management. This part is quite relevant and is often taken into very high consideration by auditors because it derives from one of the most important innovations of the new management system standards, keeping a very close eye on your interested parties. Outsourcing management is the main topic of Clause 8.1.4. It states, the organization must establish, implement, and maintain one or more processes to keep the supply of products and services under control in order to ensure compliance with its OH&S management system. It means that every time our company does something that requires some level of interaction with another company, new risks may rise, and they have to be considered. In some cases, the workers of other companies may be harmed by the activities of your company. Think of some activities such as cleaning of your company. If an external company does the cleaning, you should ask yourself, are the workers of that company adequately trained about the risks of your company? Do they know where it is safe to clean and where some extra precautions are needed? Think of all the accidents that could occur if a cleaning company operates in an area without knowing its risks. In some other cases, the opposite may as well happen. It could be that your workers are the ones affected by the activities of other companies. This usually happens in workplaces like construction sites, in which different companies have to work together. And, just one step more, in this example, both Contractor A and Contractor B are working for you. You can't really exclude that two different contractors hurt one another while working in your company. If you think about it, this is just the logical consequence of the mindset of the 45,001 that wanted us to think of how a company could influence the OH&S of all the relevant interested parties, and of course, how they could influence the company's OH&S. So, how can we tackle these kind of problems? The organization must ensure that the requirements of its OH&S management system are met by its contractors and their workers, and this needs to include OH&S criteria for selection of contractors. What does this mean? An organization can use a variety of tools for managing contractors, but in a general way of speaking, we can say that this is usually done by setting clear rules on pre-qualification criteria, control criteria. We will see what these two things exactly mean. For now, we will say the exact same thing that we already said before, for other sets of rules. Giving yourself rules is probably not enough. Writing these rules into a procedure is the best solution. By pre-qualification criteria, we mean that a 45,001 certified company should always consider OH&S performances every time it has to choose between different contractors. This is done by making mandatory that every contractor needs to have specific requirements in order to be employed by your company. Some of these requirements are not OH&S related, but some have to be. In other words, these kinds of rules prevent the risk of employing contractors that do not respect minimum OH&S requirements. In this slide, you may see that your company can choose between Contractor A and Contractor B. The OH&S specialist evaluates them through specific pre-qualification criteria. Contractor A passes, therefore he can come into my factory and work for me. While Contractor B doesn't pass. He can't pass my factory's gates. He will not work for me. Maybe Company B is cheaper, and therefore at first it could seem better, especially by the point of view who allocates the budgets. But thanks to these rules, Company A gets the contract. Before proceeding, a little note. This is a very simplified example. If a company doesn't pass pre-qualification criteria, usually companies give their contractors some time to improve themselves, and therefore be compliant with the organization's requirements. We talked about pre-qualification criteria. What about control criteria? Control criteria are the controls that your company does on your contractor while they are employed, because you need to be sure that they live up to your expectation. This is done through control criteria, which could be more or less fixed, depending on your company's needs. It could be a very simple checklist in which you write down if they wear PPE, if they respect your OH&S procedures, if any accident or near miss happened, and so on. Also, the result of the audits can be put into these checklists. So, should we use pre-qualification criteria or control criteria? We have to use both. Pre-qualification criteria are used before choosing the contractor, and control criteria are used while they work for you, to check if they keep their promises. Subchapter 8.5 Emergency Preparedness and Response. A safe workplace is ensured also by having a detailed plan of what to do if an emergency occurs. This is done not only to protect the company's workers, but also to protect other relevant interested parties such as contractors, visitors, neighbors, and emergency services personnel. In this chapter, we will see the requirements of the 45,001 standard regarding this very important topic. You might remember that we talked a lot about prevention, which means always making this question first. What could happen? Well, when prevention is applied to emergency preparedness, we ask ourselves something more. We ask ourselves, what could happen, and what should we do if it happens? Here you can see our OH&S professional on top. And here on the bottom you can see the results of his thinking, which we will talk about with our usual step-by-step approach. The answer to the question what could happen is making a description of the different scenarios that could occur. In our example, the company thought of 3 possible scenarios. The first emergency situation is a fire emergency. The second emergency situation is a flood. The third emergency is the abrupt interruption of electrical power. The third emergency is the abrupt interruption of electrical power. The answer to the question, what should we do if it happens, is making procedures in which is written what the company should do to respond, the so-called emergency plans. In our example, the emergency situation 1 has to be dealt with what is written in the emergency plan 1. The emergency situation 2 has to be dealt with what is written in emergency plan 2, and so on. So, we said that the document in which the company writes down possible scenarios and the procedures to face them is called emergency plan. This document should have this minimum content: organizational roles, responsibilities, and authorities of personnel. Who knows how to operate fire extinguishers? Who knows what to do in case of spillage of dangerous material? Details of the actions to be taken by personnel during the emergency. How to do the evacuation of the company's premises. When identifying potential emergencies, consideration should be given to emergencies that can occur subject to both normal and abnormal conditions. For example, operation startup or shutdown, construction activities, etc. Also, particular attention should be given to how a specific emergency could affect people with limited mobility, vision, or hearing. One last thing. Of course, your emergency plan has to be a written document. Most important of all, 45,001 certified companies have to do periodic testing of emergency preparedness and response process. In other words, emergency safety drills should be done at least once a year. The organization should plan these emergency safety drills and be sure that all the scenarios are tested once in a while. There is no point in having 3 emergency plans and always test the same one. Finally, the OH&S specialist should always write down a report of the emergency drill, in which is reported how quick was the response, if the workers were ready and well trained on the correct procedures, if any problem occurred. These tests have a double effect. Result 1, training of workers. These drills are a very effective way to train workers. Result 2, improve scenarios. By analyzing the results of the drills, the OH&S specialist finds out which part of the emergency plan needs to be improved. We will talk about this second result in the following slide. So, once the emergency plan is written down, the organization should set some rules about how often it should be reviewed. Periodically, the company's managers and the EHS specialists should review the emergency plans. Maybe they need to be updated because something changed in the company's work layout. Or maybe something changed in the company's processes. Or maybe, as we said in the slide before, during the emergency drills, something didn't work as planned, and therefore there is need to change the plans. Let's make an example. This year, our company decides to make an emergency drill in which scenario 1 is simulated. The emergency drill is done and the result of the simulation is bad. Workers take too much time to notice the drill, and only 90% of the workers get out in time. This result is so negative that the OH&S specialist has to review the emergency plan 1 and change the ways this kind of emergency is dealt with. So, a new edition of Emergency Plan 1 is published. It's called Emergency Plan 1, Second Edition. Of course, this new edition will be tested in the following years. So, you see, with this step-by-step approach, a 45,001 certified company could gradually improve the way it manages OH&S. Subchapter 8.6, Determination of Legal Requirements. Before starting this chapter, one very important disclaimer. In the standard, this topic is dealt with in Clause 6.1.3, so it belongs to the plan section. Nevertheless, we decided to put it in this chapter since this is one of the parts of the standard that gives us indications about how to do a specific process. Clause 6.1.3 states that the organization must establish, implement, and maintain one or more processes to determine which legal requirements could apply. In the following slides, we'll see how. Firstly, the company should determine and have access to updated legal requirements and other requirements applicable to its hazards and its OH&S risks. This means that the company needs, first of all, to determine which laws, better called legal requirements, apply to his OH&S system. The most efficient way to do this is usually through the help of specialized consultants, which have the technical knowledge to understand which law may apply or not. This is needed because in many countries the regulation about OH&S is not simple at all. Legal requirements could include acts and statutory instruments, permits and other forms of authorization, improvement or prohibition notices issued by local or national government, in Europe, EU directives or regulations, national laws. Also, safety requests by your clients could and actually should be considered. So in this oversimplified example, there are 3 OH&S laws, but only Law 1 and Law 2 apply to your company. In other words, you should be very pragmatic and write exactly what your company does to be compliant. In this example, you can see that Law 1 needs some things to be done, represented by this set of gears. Law 2 needs some things to be done, and that's why you can see a set of gears coming out of it. As said before, Law 3 is not linked to any requirement since it does not apply to the organization. Then, finally, your management system should take into account these legal requirements and other requirements in the establishment, implementation, maintenance, and continuous improvement of its management system for OSH. To put it simply, your company should properly manage these requirements. The most common way to satisfy this requirement is by making a sort of list of legal requirements the company has to take into account. For each of the legal requirements, the organization should also write down what the company does to be compliant with said legal requirements. Let's make an example. We'll talk about the REACH regulation, which addresses the production and use of chemical substances and their potential impacts on both human health and the environment. Every European company that deals with chemicals has to follow it, which has many different implications. So, in the legal requirement column, we'll just write REACH regulation. In the detail column, we can put the full technical name of this law, Regulation EC number 1907/2006. Then, in the applicable column, we will write yes if our company manages chemicals and therefore has to follow this law. We will write no if our company doesn't manage chemicals at all. In this specific example, we'll write yes. Then, in the compliancy column, we will write what our company does to be compliant with this law. In this example, we will write that our company needs to have a database of all the information related to the substances it handles. To be specific, this database is made of all the safety sheets of these substances. The safety sheet is a document in which the seller wrote everything you need to know to store and use this product safely. But to tell the truth, just having a list of applicable legal requirements is not enough. You need to have a proper process. The 45001 standard goes even further by asking organizations to have also a process that guarantees that your map of legal requirements keeps being updated. So, you have to prove that not only you are doing things right, but you are capable to keep doing them right in the future. The way most companies are compliant with these requirements is by having specific rules about how to make the map of applicable legal requirements, how to make a periodic check on this map, what are the requirements needed for the employees and/or consultants that make this periodic check. As for the frequency of this check, ideally the more the better. This is needed because companies need to know about new laws and their requirements on time to gain the needed resources to be compliant. Most companies decide to be immediately updated by subscribing to specified newsletters, but check the map of legal requirements just once a year. With this lesson, we just ended Chapter 8. And, to be specific, we also ended our so-called due uphill. Let's stick to this metaphor. Just like after hiking a mountain, we are allowed to feel a little bit tired, but also quite satisfied. With these last 2 chapters, we finally understood how to put in practice most of the requirements of the standard. Our final goal is quite close. Thanks for following the course so far. If you need some help or have any questions on these topics, please send us an email at occam@occam-consult.com. See you on Chapter 9, Performance Evaluation.